which had been created by the Government of Canada only a few months before, was thrown out, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Now, the Ukrainian-Canadian Committee, established in November of 1940 by the Government of Canada, cast about in those mid-war years for a project. What can we do to prove our utility during the war and after the war? And of course, one of the things they became very much involved with, thanks to the intervention of Ukrainian-Canadian veterans serving overseas, was the issue of the displaced persons, the DPs, some of you. How do we rescue these people from Soviet clutches? How do we get these political refugees and victims of war to Canada? How do we prevent the forcible repatriation under the terms of the Yalta Agreement of Ukrainians back to the east? Well, KUK, or the Ukrainian-Canadian Committee as it was then known, made a number of representations to the Government of Canada, expecting that having proven their loyalty during the war, they would have some influence on the Government of Canada, on Ottawa, in terms of preventing forcible repatriation. Norman Robertson, another one of the greats in Canadian political life, commented on this in the Canadian archives. He said as follows: "It would be prejudicial to our relations with the Soviet Union if we were to make representations in the United Kingdom about the prominent Ukrainian nationalists who should not be handed over to the Soviet authorities. The Soviet government regards these people as fascists, and our interest on behalf of such men and women would be understood as an unfriendly act toward the Soviet Union. From a purely strict legal point of view, it is also no business of ours what happens to these Ukrainian nationalists. Although this could not very well be used in reply to representatives of the Ukrainian-Canadian Committee." And in fact, that becomes the tone. How do we manage, how do we manipulate, how do we make Ukrainians in Canada feel good without actually having to do anything, says the Government of Canada. The best example of this was when a delegation from the League of Ukrainian Canadians, then known as the Canadian League for the Liberation of Ukraine, went to Ottawa in November of 1957 and met with the Undersecretary of State, Mr. Luciuk. 9 of those men came from Toronto, 9 came from Toronto, 2 came from Ottawa, and 1 from Sudbury. So a delegation drawn from different parts of the country. The spokesman for the delegation was the late Stan Froelich, who some of you knew. Mr. Froelich presented a memorandum to the Government of Canada called "The Policy of Liberation as an Aspect of Canadian Foreign Policy." The minister's report following the meeting concludes with this rather unpleasant comment. The minister inquired about Ukrainian acquaintances in Winnipeg and Toronto. He thanked the delegation for their courtesy in calling and assured them that their views would be noted. And then in parentheses, he managed to make them all feel important, which as far as I could judge was the main object of their visit. In other words, pay no attention to what they're really there for, make them feel good and send them away. Or manipulate them. In 1951, Mr. J.A. McCordick from a special unit of external affairs wrote as follows: "We must bear in mind the possibility that we might eventually be able to cooperate profitably with one or more of these Ukrainian nationalist emigre organizations. To what purpose? For 2 purposes. 1, for counteracting communist influence among the foreign-born here in Canada and recent immigrants, and 2, and this was a euphemism, for conducting psychological warfare abroad. In other words, for sending people back behind the Iron Curtain, which some of the Western intelligence agencies did without much success since they were penetrated by Soviet moles. So Canada, in concert with the Americans and Britain, actually engaged Ukrainians and other refugee immigrants post-war, 51, 52, 53, sending them back behind the Iron Curtain where they met an unhappy fate. In general, despite our beliefs about how the Government of Canada, the Government of Great Britain, the Government of the United States regarded our community and its causes, the fact remains very clearly that the Canadian government in particular was not going to commit itself either directly or indirectly through CBC broadcasts to the liberation of Ukraine as an object of foreign policy for Canada. Again, Jules Léger, who had become quite prominent in Canadian political life, wrote that apart from the futility of such a policy, I strongly doubt that even in the unlikely event that the communist regime in Russia should disappear, an independent Ukraine would be a practical possibility. We would, in any case, seriously offend all great Russians by advocating Ukraine's freedom. I should be grateful, he wrote to the Undersecretary of State, if you let me know whether or not you agree with these statements, and that we should henceforth continue to avoid the issue of Ukrainian independence, instead concentrating on expressions of sympathy with Ukrainian cultural survival. That was the full extent of Canadian foreign policy making towards Ukrainian independence until 1991. Now, those are some of the examples that I wanted to share with you about racism, prejudice, indifference, hostility towards the issue of Ukrainian independence, hostility towards Ukrainian nationalism, and there are many, many more. I've only drawn a few from what are, as I've already said, voluminous files. For us, one of the interesting things I think that we should concentrate on here in Edmonton for the 23rd Ukrainian-Canadian Congress meeting is the very nature of the organization that you all are here representing today. It is irrefutable that the Ukrainian-Canadian Committee, CUC today, was created by the Government of Canada. It was created by a man known as Tracy Phillips, a British diplomat set here in 1940, specifically for the purpose of uniting a very divided Ukrainian community into one body that was intended to last only for the duration of the war. Now, Tracy Phillips was a man who wrote in a very florid style. He's a very fantastically interesting, remarkable individual. But he actually left us a memo from January of 1941 in which he talks about a tour he conducted in Western Canada in November of that year, and talked about how the unification of new Canadians and the elimination of their discords could be brought about. He wrote, in constructive diplomacy, as in bone surgery, there are two methods. The first method is the most spectacular, the most prompt, and the most popular. It is the equivalent of surgical intervention. It often requires follow-up operations. It is rapid, it is drastic, it is aggressive. One attacks the foreign element which has entered the body politique. In the realm of diplomacy, it takes the form of threat and direct action. It is a regrettable wartime technique when extended to the realm of the civilians. This, in effect, is the only method which in the time allowed could be used to unite the half-dozen discordant groups of Ukrainian Canadians. It is the least satisfactory method. In these cases, the permanence of the cure depends on the period and quality of subsequent nursing. It was by this less desirable method that the Ukrainians of Canada were got united within 1 week of this writer's first contact with them. I think it's very clear that the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, or committee in those days, was created by the Government of Canada for the war effort and was not intended to continue past the war effort, and only really did because Ukrainian-Canadian soldiers, sailors, and airmen overseas who had created the Ukrainian Club in London, England, Bogdan Panchuk, and others, Stanley Frolick among them, became involved with the rescue of the displaced persons and the political refugees, some of you and your descendants in Canada. Now, Panchuk, we can't talk about him very much here, saw the importance of rescuing the DPs as a way of reinvigorating the community, saw the existence of the Ukrainian-Canadian Committee as a unified body that could direct these operations. But he also saw the importance of working together. So Panchuk and the veterans, by then 1946, in England, rescuing the DPs, and they remained overseas, by the way, until 1953, a remarkable achievement, maintaining an office for the Ukrainian-Canadian community in London and on the continent for several years. We have trouble maintaining an office in Ottawa. Imagine the difficulties in the war and post-war years of maintaining an office overseas. Panchuk and his colleagues rescued literally tens of thousands of Ukrainians. And in the process of doing so, they came back on several occasions to participate in organized Canadian-Ukrainian life, including the second CUC Congress. CUC Congresses have always been held in Winnipeg with two exceptions, here, now, and in 1946 in Toronto. And Panchuk and his colleagues, Anne Krapleva, Tony Yadamovich and his wife Anne Panchuk came back to Toronto and participated in the second UCC Congress when there was a deep question. What do we do now? The war is over, do we continue, or do we just disband? And Panchuk said, no, we should continue. And we need to recreate the committee using the structures that were given to us by the Government of Canada. He called it the Renaissance Plan. What did the Renaissance Plan include? It included the following. First of all, we need to create an English language journal for Ukrainians in Canada with a print run of 75,000 copies. We need to create Ukrainian cultural centers that are united. We need to put a moratorium on what he called, I love the phrase, 2x4 community halls, with each organization having its own little hall and no unity. We need to have a common community school program. We need to have a common educational program. This was the pitch that Panchuk and his colleagues made to the UCC in 1946. They said, we'll stay overseas and help rescue the DPs. You agree to the Renaissance Plan. Agreed, and the UCC agreed, and then promptly tore up the document, a copy of which remains in only one place, and that is in Osoredek, our own community archives, and of course it's since been copied elsewhere. Needless to say, Panchuk and his colleagues were deeply dismayed by the betrayal they felt at Cook's behavior. And writing about this, he said something that I think we need to focus on and think about today. And this will be the final sort of quotation from the archives. Panchuk described the situation in the Ukrainian-Canadian community in 1946 as being akin to that described in the famous novel, The Last of the Mohicans. And he wrote as follows, and I don't think it's changed very much. Our people don't read. Our people don't study. Our people don't listen. They don't worship. They don't attend anything higher than Mickey Mouse movie halls or engage in drunken brawls. Our school teachers from coast to coast are a hopeless mob of stupid parasites with no spine or mind of their own. As for the refugees and the DPs and the victims of a war, our people, generally speaking, don't know a thing about them and aren't interested. So long as they find themselves all right, the world doesn't concern them. So, I started out by reminding you of that famous formula that if you don't learn your history, you'll be forced to repeat it. In fact, my years of study in the archives suggest to me that, in fact, what history teaches us is that we do not learn from history. Thank you.